Hello everyone, today we talk about the genesis of the Kyivan Rusʹ, about which I made other videos, especially in the early years of Schwerpunkt, and that therefore we need to update a little bit and also widen. Just this is part of the historical regions series, but we'll have to go in fact in detail in all the various eras or other just thematic aspects of the Kyivan Rusʹ, which is a huge chapter deserving all the possible attention. And this is just like a mild introduction to some aspects of the origins of the relation between the Varangians and the Slavic populations, the foundation of the Kyivan state specifically. And so partly looking at in great part actually looking at the historiographical nuisances, right? Because of, from one side, the relatively scarce information on the basis of historical evidence, and thus the various interpretations that have arisen throughout the centuries regarding the consolidation of this power that literally made what we know as Eastern Europe, even though that separation, mostly in the way we intend it today, occurred later, right? The Rus, as we've seen also from the videos about Poland, were actually very similar until the Mongol era to, in fact, the Central Europeans, right? Not just there were great connections between the two areas, but if you look at the political, institutional, and in part also socio-economical forms, there is even a shared commonality that requires, in fact, in that regard, more attention, because great part of the nuisances revolving around how the Rus was founded, etc., derive from a historiography that in the High Middle Ages, when the Kyivan Grand Principality, and thus also this hegemony based on the alleged common blood of the so-called Rurikids and so on, was a dynastic history, right? Written by these, in fact, princes to stress their legitimacy as such, and thus partially obscuring the importance of the people, right? Especially the middle estates, right, of the great cities, towns of the large Russian rivers that are the true protagonists of the Russian parabola. That lasted also an important amount of time. We're talking essentially about half a millennium, with also a previous history that is, as you understand, difficult to document, even as far as when were certain cities founded and what do we mean by that, right? The same Kyiv, but Chernihiv and others. Like, there are legends about that. These were all areas that had known the world broadly meant. They had been in contact with the Roman Empire, with other polities, at a point the Abbasid Caliphate, and beyond. Because as we'll see, the role they performed also in international trade was really transcontinental at a point, right? They connected Khazaria, even China, with Central, Northern Europe, the same Mediterranean. So they knew the world, but Eastern Europe, as you know, was historically kind of more sparsely populated, at least, not generally less in absolute terms, at least because these are huge spaces, large parts of which were covered in forests, in swamps, etc. But even about this, we're talking about a very varied landscape, right, with, in fact, many different neighbors. And the internal balance of the Rus with the preeminence, the hegemony of Kyiv, speaks there of a very interesting hybrid that was taking place exactly on that center on the Dnieper River, that the enormous fortune of which, let's put it in this way, has to be explained in ways that are, I've found the more time passes, the more I read about this, very similar to the same rise of Rome, right? And this parallelism is often not traced, if not for the fact that the Kyivan Rusʹ acted as a sort of third Rome, mostly due to the contact with Constantinople, this kind of imperial ideology that shrouded, in fact, what appears to have been the sacrality of especially the early Russian rulers. This fact is often overlooked, but banally just look at the names of these people. Names like Sviatoslav, everybody ended in Slav, first of all, which is the equivalent of glory of the Holy Ghost, so the imperium sent by divine messengers. And so in their mindset, this was so deeply ingrained, and this is generally speaking true for all the Slavs, as you see from the migration era and onwards, that makes you reflect on also what kind of the background of the Slavs and early the Proto-Slavs could be, because aside from the Norse presence that we have, that is the most hotly debated one, and of course occurred mostly later, there is also an incredible trace of Iranian elements all over, actually, Central and Eastern Europe, that have a very specific meaning. I made some videos regarding this topic, especially as far as the origins of the Serbs are concerned, but it could be, we've seen it also for the Croats, etc. So I will be covering, as you know, step by step in detail of these various peoples and their origins and so on. But what you see being adopted by the same Norse, that surely had warlike onomastics as well, but not quite in the same glorious, celestial, splendid way, right, that we find even probably in this Slavic context. It was also a pretty powerful one, right, especially after the Khivans managed to fundamentally crush the Khazar Khaganate. You have a major power that will run out of strength, like any civilization, just or at least stagnating by the eve of the Mongol conquest. And never underestimate the cause of Mongol achievements, but because that is a dynamic which is often overlooked, like what were the peoples eventually were taken over by the Mongols doing, and what was eventually their role even afterwards. Because if you look at the old Russian Palatinate, you realize that even as far as the broader was coming to be known as Russia was concerned, was still by far the most culturally advanced area, essentially up to the 17th, the 18th century. And I have a playlist on Ukrainian history that especially tells you the role of these people within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the same, especially Habsburgic Galicia, in very modern times, like even between the age of the partitions, the late 18th to the early 20th century, and they're all that tradition that even the Unionist Church, that very often is considered like another thing compared like to the so-called Russian one, in fact, but that was actually the original Russian church, and that the title of which has been somehow simply stripped arbitrarily by the Muscovites without any source of legitimization but themselves, right? So this is yet another aspect that today we do not look at, if not in the aforementioned way, like considering the commonalities existing with Poland, even shared power at some point, as you know, and as we've seen in some Polish history videos. Even the proximity, I made a bit about Galicia, Volhynia in the late Middle Ages, as we've seen these Russian princes dealt with politics as far as the Austrian one, right? But must be reconsidered, because it's as if it was a huge submerged European cultural identity that has been somehow lost in the waves of statalism, nationalism, communism, the sheer abortion of the dignity of mankind that the Soviet Union was, and that we are essentially rediscovering now, I would say for obvious reasons, but also because they are historically assessed. Like, we're not discovering them now. This was normal history until our hyper-specialization essentially stopped making us culturally aware about what before, like a normally educated person that was still, yes, kind of the elite, but would know in general, in common knowledge, right? And I think that, especially for the recovery of an imperial European identity, a common European school should start addressing these topics very, very clearly. So even today, as you know, I don't have time to digress on these specific things. But again, aside from the Ukrainian history playlist, there was also a Russian history playlist, etc. There, I already set a bit of a background. We can start from that. As we were saying before, there are lots of uncertainties regarding especially the political genesis of the Kyivan Rusʹ. Most of the historiographical interests instead revolved, because again of political cultural reasons, and as a reaction to the same, etc., around the ethnic issue. That, in my opinion, is a non-problem, because I think that the erasures in 9th, 10th century Eastern Europe there are pretty clear, right? We can't be unsure about who founded what, or let's say how certain rulers identified in a broader sense. But first of all, this should require an insight on the broader mindset of the time that naturally is very difficult to reconstruct and definitely impossible to fully do so. But that we have a bit looked at in the videos about traditional religion, right, and all what derived from it. And this word was, in fact, some of the furthest in Europe from modernization and secularization at the time. So that some hints are actually pretty eloquent in my opinion. But as I was saying before, there is in fact, an effervescence deriving from, especially the position of the frontier with the Khazar Empire, the role that Kyiv came to acquire accordingly, and how essentially the poorer north that was more easily also colonized by the Norse settlers began to provide, as a matter of fact, with some military, specialized military, the, in fact, armed wing of certain polities were already coalescing in a very advanced way and capable, thanks to that leadership, to literally crush the Khazar Empire, to even go as far as attacking Constantinople and opening this major contact with the latter, eventually it turned out mostly in a peaceful fashion, even though quite gradually so, to make the Russian Palatinate, as we know it, the most prestigious land in Eastern Europe. Prior to the emergence of Kyivan Rusʹ in the 9th century, most of the area north of the Black Sea, which roughly overlaps with modern-day Ukraine and Belarus, was primarily populated by Eastern Slavic tribes. Right, this is at least an obvious statement from any indicator we have. There are debates naturally on the margins, on the, in fact, what the frontier really was, what some, especially peoples in the northeast, were in relation to this essential Slavic expansion that, as we will see, was a bit ideologically stereotyped in history as a sort of, especially from the socialistic historiography that wanted to see these peoples as just essentially not necessarily harmless, but mostly peaceful peasants that just expanded, bringing the strength of their hard work on the fields as a broader kind of demographic and agricultural colonization. The thing actually was much more brutal, and due to, of course, the presence of a somehow more developed political and military system, that is what mostly credited. And the reason being that the Slavs, and we made multiple videos about this topic, if you look in the migration era playlist on the medieval Slavs 1, etc., is normally described like, especially during the very migration era that I give you in the East, maybe stretches in time a bit longer, but would have occurred through the shepherding of the local sedentary peoples, in this case the Proto-Slavs or the Slavs proper, by populations mostly of Iranian stock towards this very later period, also with the appearance of the Turks, but that the same Kyivan Rusʹ strengthens to essentially stamp successfully and rising as the hegemonic power around. And exactly in the areas that are somehow debatedly kind of being possibly even colonized and, founded as fortifications, etc., by the same Khazars, right? Some have proposed even a Turkic etymology for the same Kiev in a way. This is not different from even what happened in Rome. This doesn't, it was an Etruscan name, but the fact that the locals were Latins, as a matter of fact, and that they were actually in that sense on a frontier and in a quite prosper area on a major river with a fertile surroundings, made things very difficult for an autocratic government like the Turkic one being affirmed, and actually brought in part some benefits because the Khazars originally were, as you know, very also very entrepreneurial in trade. They had connections with Caliphate. They control important waterways, trade routes, and so on, but also conferring the local Slavic elites with probably some greater certification and power, thus allowing this same aristocracies to, doesn't matter whether led by Norse mercenaries, chieftains, constables, condottieri, whatever you want to call them, but still from their background, the same Khazars, and again establishing that especially north-south axis, but also east and west that cross in Kiev and confer this enormous power to the principality to extend over others that, even though never directly controlled, remained, as you know, as part of this broader net of the idea of the various Russias, in a sense, and that were headed by Kiev, where also Christianization started from, or at least was the most successful, because the country was simply more prepared to civilization than, say, the far north or east, right? So this aspect is interesting. But we're also talking about an important frontier in the southeast that is essentially overlapping the environmental one between, say, with a steppe in practice, and as opposed to the more agricultural areas where the Slavic farmlands arose. There is, in fact, an important resistance that the Slavs historically had that can be studied even banally through their apology, their military history, their tactics, to the nomadic peoples. Right, the civilization was from the side of the sedentaries anyway, and when you study this enormous crescent that stretches from southwest to the northeast, from the Balkans to the Rus, you realize that there are very specific military forms that are perfectly suited for a sedentary people to counter the steppes cavalries. And again, I have an entire playlist about Slavic warfare as well, so I discuss it here and there. But it's something you can really observe throughout the centuries, because these areas remained always somehow frontier, right? Waves of of nomads always hit these areas sooner or later, and yet the local communities remained practically what they were. Yes, there were areas in the frontier that were kind of re-nomadized, right? There are even the Cossacks that technically, from the same etymology, would be the Kazakhs, who are of some Turkic origin, as you know, in modern contemporary era, were most obviously not just random Indo-European descendants that we could find even among the Turks, as a matter of fact, but properly, even Semitic, very close or identical to anyone, to ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Russians, and so on. That's another topic, as you understand. There's a lot to tell, even about the Tatars later, etc., but we will do it in another video. In the region, in the northern region, around Novgorod, the old Novgorod, where the Ilmen Slavs and neighboring Krivichi lived, the same Slavic expansion had brought these peoples to reach as far as the old Novgorod in the north, right, where the Ilmen Slavs lived, and these were apparently descendants from the Polabians and the Severians. So also coming from regions such as the Elbe, apparently, like naturally we can't just pretend that they were transplanted there. Of course, it was a mix with other groups of same Slavs Jews that had settled and colonized further, pushing mostly against the Finns, right? There were the neighboring Krivichis or Krivichs as well. There were yet another tribal union of early East Slavs who occupied territories surrounding the headwaters of the West Dvina, the Daugava, the Dnieper, and the Volga rivers. So we're arriving until up to the Caspian Sea by some degree. Again, in between, especially in the easternmost regions, it's not that easy to tell who's who, right? There is, I don't know, we've made a bit about the Volga Bulgars, for example. We understand even in that location there were Slavic elements that made up the same Islamic, what we call as Islamic Turkic Khaganate, but it was naturally a much more complex sum of peoples and of leaders. Consider especially this, that as far as we can see, especially the influence of the Iranians first, the Turks later, had brought to an importantly developed equestrian culture. Even among the westernmost Slavs, such as the Poles, we see still by the 11th century armies made up 1/3 of horsemen, right? So this before the feudalization, the having of cavalry, according to the Frankish model, and thus the narrowing of the numbers, at least of those elements. So, but we're talking, these were sedentary peoples naturally, but we're talking about a massive, to say the least, bias from the top equestrian culture of the steppes that again dated to Iranian times. And naturally, many of these peoples were also descendants of the older Iranians that inhabited the areas and or that had migrated there after the waves of the Huns and other populations later on, and that had probably also somehow hegemonized the locals, right, and created, in fact, kind of vertical systems with an important degree of kind of aristocracy and an individual military power, as far as also the equipment, the arms and armor really were. Because there is this, say, standard picture of the fact that at least these peoples were, again, mostly infantry, and they were mostly agricultures that hid when, I don't know, the raids of the nomads arrived. But actually, if you look at their military, you realize that they were very different from that, and they had very interesting stage of development. Surely for, say, the most developed areas in southwestern Europe, that's not quite kind of comparable, and this is evidenced by the general instability of the political social system. But we also know a very few about that directly, at least in a properly documentary way. So we mostly rely on accounts that still show us, however, a lot of back and forth, and the same even in the relation with the Varangians that didn't, quite suddenly invade the area and begin to lord over. We know traditionally also an expulsion, a previous expulsion of the Norse, etc. And we have to distinguish which lands we're talking about. That was mostly happening on the Baltic, but the later histories tend to generalize a bit, like also from the perspective of the Russian Palatinate, where again those princes were kind of telling their own story as opposed to what was probably the more general reality of this still somehow, yes, kind of, you can say egalitarian people, not in an anarchic or communistic sense at all, but rather in the fact that the Slavs, especially by that time, the 9th to 10th century, were also expanding dramatically from a demographic and economic point of view, with a remarkable force, like in the rest of Europe, and that needed some kind of more vertical forms of government that weren't quite like a Norse conquest, but something a bit more played by the people altogether, to common benefit again, because this policy the Kyivan Rusʹ eventually rose to dramatic power, as we know. In the far north, so in the areas of the Ladoga Lake or the region of Karelia, there were also the Finnic tribes, such as the Chuds, for example. These were even more kind of properly savage, primitive, and definitely backwards populations. So, as you know, were pushed historically just to the corner, to further isolation by the Scandinavians, the Slavs, etc. In the south, in the area around Kyiv, as we were saying, there were the Polans, right, a group of Slavic tribes, some say Slavicized, right, with Iranian origins even, which, is a fair point to make. At least ethnicity is a matter of political identity, not really of genetics. Even though at this time these things did matter as well, much more than we're usually told, like a history where there was no ethnic divide, but it was a matter of power, right? And so we know that the Iranians too had pretty kind of stratified society. They had this important lordships. So it's fair to say, as we were saying before, it was an important mix between the two elements. Then there were the Drevlians to the west of the Dnieper River, these Severians to the east. To their north, there were the Viatici, that were somehow still Slavs. And then you had this, as we were saying before, balance between the forested land, or at least the non-steppe ones, occupied by the Slavic farmers, with this nomadic herdsmen at the frontier, with whom, of course, they heavily interacted, but also with, thanks to the Metros Hostiles, an important degree of development, right? Because also the south was richer. I mean, talking about the Russian south, not the steppes per se, and thus there were the resources to put up an important resistance that developed earlier, also just because they were closer to civilization, to the Byzantine Empire, to the Basic Caliphate, and so on. More trade, more exports, and more hierarchies, right? Better equipped, better trained, more motivated armies, right? As opposed to the north, was somehow more tribal, wilder, and in that sense less developed. Depending also on the various centers. For example, Novgorod was significantly advanced compared to, say, what existed in the rest of the Russian center north in general, but that was mostly because of the position on the Baltic, and the important trade, as you know, was developing in the whole area because of the Viking activity and beyond. And that's where the relation between the Varangians and the Slavs begins, because the question is, who were the Rus? You know that there are various etymologies, and the most accurate one seems to be essentially the finization of an Old Norse term that you can find in some Eastern Scandinavian toponyms as well, rod, from which Rus practically, that refers to rowers. So there would be an equivalent of Vikings, at least visually, right? So these were the men who came by ship, also crossing this imposing Russian river, in fact, waterways for trade, loot, and conquest, right? As we were saying before, there has always been a relative controversy regarding who was who in the process of political and ethnic genesis of the Kyivan Rusʹ here. Scholarly attention nowadays mostly focused on how quickly an ancestrally Norse people, so we're talking about these Vikings, right? Varangian literally means like these brotherhoods of military brotherhoods of mercenaries from there, that were probably those who had sworn the oath to the divinity, entering in this initiatically in this military transfiguring war band, and gang literally means those who traveled, who went on this expedition, but as a broader lifestyle, right? And how quickly, in fact, these assimilated into Slavic culture. And in my opinion, it's a non-problem, because it's self-evident that the Norse were just a tiny minority compared to the entirety of the Eastern Slavic lands that were fundamentally all encompassed by the Rus eventually, right? So the mechanism that, in my opinion, is much more interesting is the political, social, and military one taking place, in fact, in what would become the center of the Rus. And why, for example, the center of the system became Kyiv and not, somewhere closer to the Norse homeland, right? And the obvious answer is that yes, it was obviously, yes, we can't say Norse Slavic, but still overwhelmingly Slavic system. And there is a huge debate about this for a reason that is antipathetic, that we'll see now. That is to say, first of all, again, methodologically, we have accounts just from later centuries, and these are legends. Like, the local literature is not particularly, scientific. It's just, again, a collection of foundation myths, and not something like as we can document France or Italy at the same time. The problem is that such just apparent ambiguity was instrumentalized, right? Mostly for, again, political reasons, reasons of ethnic hegemony for some reason. Especially the Stalinist period wanted to erase any connection with the Germanic background of the Rus, right? Which is nonsensical, because of course there was, right? The Norse did infiltrate, and they were a tiny minority, but it's not that they were insignificant. Like, we do see genetic traces by a degree, but it's not important per se. You have to understand who they were and which role they performed in that system. And as we'll see, it was mostly a military one, and we'll see now why. And there was also, in more later times, an attempt, of course, to claim just, say, a purely, Slavic dimension to it, because before even the Nazi propaganda stressed the fact that there was mostly actually just a Norse element. The answer there is always, again, realizing that Indo-Europeans all come from the same cauldron, but these areas were also particularly ancestral as far as probably if you are interested in the genetic side of the story. Solar symbolism, the mythology, of course, communism as the denial of any possible trace of humanity is obsessed. Like, as you know, the communist Marxist historiography freaks out in front of Germanic or Roman culture and the pure expression of universal imperial glory, and all what essentially, in fact, the Indo-Europeans believed in, because the purpose is properly to deplete mankind of any trace of itself, and so just making it functional to the systems of production in any form of individual value is eliminated, right? The process is towards the sub-personal, even in the ascetic dimension that even Marxism by the degree claims, right? So in lands like Eastern Europe that were ravaged by Bolshevism, by Leninism, by Stalinism, by genocide, by deportations, by ethnic conflict, by the Second World War, the Nazi invasion, the Soviet purges, and all the terrible things that occurred, and mostly in a time in history in which it was possible to erase that traditional background from the educational system, etc. And don't think that, in fact, countries like Russia have ever, abandoned that the mentality. It was properly a cultural eraser. It's easy to manipulate any kind of, especially also by the state, because this is done in a country like Russia. Anything that is objective reality, right? If you succeed, as this system has, in eliminating from the population the awareness of the difference between objective and subjective, between absolute and relative, you can't play with them, telling them any lie, any joke, and in a perpetual state of paranoia. You can't make them believe anything, just as we're witnessing nowadays. So whatever comes from that background is mostly, interested in a sociological or even psychiatric sense, but it has nothing to do with history by any scientific or moral standard. However, I think that the historiographical concerns in this regard have literally exceeded what is in fact, the subject matter, right? There is a broader global crisis of scientific and moral quality, aside from this other more narrow dynamics. But if one looks at the times and the places, it shouldn't be that difficult to assess what occurred, especially if you use a diachronic and comparative method, naturally with all the due precautions, right? And I will not even comment what the popular awareness, even in any part of the world, is about this topics. That is practically non-existent anywhere in the world, well, that's in fact another story. But we must rely, in fact, on the primary sources, and the primary chronicle that is exactly called like this, that is the earliest written source for these Slavs, and containing, in fact, mostly the narrative that by that 12th century had been sedimented as the, if you want, national, Latinly meant history of these peoples really were. You realize again that the thing I profiled before in a sort of dynastic perspective, right? And today, again, it's just about the origins. We'll not talk about the Kyivan Rusʹ history, even especially after, when we start knowing many more things during the 11th, the 12th century, etc. But that were confirmed by the rest of the historiography that essentially relied a bit just like us today on these sources already. Of course, it was plenty of there is a huge, like for anywhere in the world at the time, amount of folklore, of legends, of an actual historical knowledge next to the myth, right, that we will unfortunately never know. But the fact that this was the accepted narrative, broadly speaking, even at the level of the establishment, is much more meaningful than it seems. Because from one side you can observe the dialogue, if not conflict and competition, between the princes and, say, the same cities that they ruled on, especially the mercantile estates that, until the Mongol times, that changed dramatically in brutal authoritarianism, the entire system, especially from the east, but also in fact crippling significantly the local economy, also due to the general crisis eventually of the mid-14th century. This power was challenged in a sense. There was a strong substratum that had backed the same elites, right, that were trying to say, well, we are in charge because we essentially were of the race of the conquerors. We all share this, that were seen as holy, as we will see now, and sacred, and this is often overlooked, especially in what was still a pagan context, right? Until Olga and her son. And that thus was a way to draw power per se on them in a situation that evidently was not so easy nor definitive per se. So by challenging such Norse descent, some political sides have tended to say, well, this is not true, thus, it was prevalently a Slavic system, so it's not even true that the Varangians were, let's say, not the fact that they weren't Norse, but that the Rus were present before the arrival of the Varangians. And so that what we actually see in Slavic, in these accounts, even as in fact evidently Scandinavian-derived words, they actually were replaced by Slavic names because the elite still was mainly Slavic even after this. This is, like, by a certain degree accurate. It's always a matter of degree. It's always seeing how, whether you want to consider the glass half empty or half full, right? Do you want to say that these were essentially rulers of North descent floating on a Slavic aristocracy? Do you want to say that these actually were blending together? They're all correct. The point is, of course, that especially in the south, especially in the Kyivan Rusʹ, the Slavic presence was stronger, even in a political sense, much stronger than it was in the north, where there were more like scattered tribes, right? So it's obvious that from one side you see the major dynasts mostly wanting to stress their own authority by claiming common descent that was not part of the ethnic majority of the population. But first of all, the contrast was not even so dramatic at the time. It was just a way to claim status. And secondly, they were obviously, if not Slavicized, right? So it's really not a particular problem. But again, I think it's more interesting is how they came to power. We'll see now. We can definitely see also the other way around. For example, there are Slavic influences in the Swedish language, aside from just the significant Scandinavian one in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And yes, it's difficult to answer who the Rus specifically were, because we will find some sources now that tend to kind of stress a sort of ethnic divide between the rulers and the subjects. But this was not like the migration of a people that literally took over another in an imperialistic forms. What happened here was literally in the form of war bands, at some point taking over the rule of certain communities, with the decisive moral support of which could have never ruled there, right? And of course, this is more a problem of political philosophy than of actual history. Of course, this was again a Slavic system with just essentially an important military element represented by the Norse one. It's a bit what happened in the Romano-Germanic world, where essentially those countries were and stayed Romance overwhelmingly, and the Germanic element was just absorbed and eventually immediately assuming that the characteristics of the locals were also, by the way, more advanced. And this is something that it would be interesting to assess as far as especially the Russian South was concerned, right? Because the Norse were far from kind of, especially we're talking about here the middle Viking Age, the 10th century, the late 9th, they were pretty primitive in many ways. You can argue that also Eastern Europe, by an important degree, was, yes, but the extent of political, institutional, economical, and social development in the Rus were superior, as a matter of fact, to Scandinavia. And it would remain for an important amount of time. So, again, this is especially true for the Kyivan Principality. There is an enormous debate on this. Consider that, of course, things changed at the time as well. Like by the 9th century, it's obvious that the Rus were more like the Norse, while by the 11th century the Rus were the Slavs as such, right? So it depends on just how the term is used, right? There are as famous as explicit historical sources of the time that document who the Rus were in this sense. For example, Ahmad ibn Fadlan was an Arab traveler of the 10th century, providing at least one of the earliest written descriptions of the Rus, and says, "They are as tall as a date palm, blonde and ruddy, so that they do not need to wear a tunic nor a cloak. Rather, the men among them wear garments that only cover half of his body and leaves one of his hands free." Right? You know that red hair do not exist among ethnic Slavs, at least, you know, in an original sense. You find them mostly in the Baltic area because that's where the people blended more with the Scandinavians. And telling you the truth, even red hair are kind of mostly concentrated in the British Isles, right, and also in parts of Gaul, northern Italy, rather. So the thing is, even more than Germany, interestingly enough. So this speaks also of a much more extended area of that far north, as far as the population dynamic, let's say, even the colonization and people's movement was concerned. Liutprand of Cremona, imperial ambassador of the Ottonians, was sent twice to Constantinople in 949 and 968, and in his accounts he identifies as the Russi in Latin the Norse, right? He says, Rusios quos alio nos nomine, nord mannos appellamos. Right, so the Rus, which we also call Normans, interestingly enough, but consider this is an Italian source, right? Who visited Constantinople. The Normans were known, of course, also in the West in a broader sense. So it's not that Liutprand was necessarily thinking of Eastern Europe per se, but was saying, look, that there is a connection between these two peoples, because at least it was understood that the establishment was made up partly of these individuals, and that's what really mattered of the time. It's not that people were looking at ethnic cross sections for us to say, oh, now we know exactly who was who, but they are very eloquent in that sense by saying that at least those with whom the Byzantines had to cope at that time were essentially seen as these Norsemen, as leaders at least. And there is also, however, another specification, especially about the physical traits of the Rus, because it says, gens quedam est sub Aquilonis parte constituta, quam a qualitate corporis Greci vocant, Rusios, nos vero a positione loci nominamus Nordmannos. That really means, there is a certain people which is made of a part of those who are sub Aquilonis, literally means being, it's an equivalent of the Normans, as we will see now also in the second period, it says. So because that was also a bit the ethnographic idea that existed since the migration era. That was somehow, now it's complicated. It was part both of the Indo-European mythology, but generally speaking also of the classical ethnography. That was a broader north where all peoples had come from, including, say, the same, all the ancestors of all the various Indo-European peoples in Europe, right? So this was more like a broader concept than a merely specific one. Even though it was meant also in here, like these people are the Normans themselves, what were called Normans at the time, because the rest of the phrase, of course, goes like these are people that live that are apart only, interestingly enough, of those who live in the north. So it identifies the fact that some of these people had come from there, but now they were in the Rus, in fact, as Rus themselves. This is the most important point, that the Greeks, so in this case the Byzantines, called in fact the Rus on account of their physical features, right? And that we as Westerners designate as Norsemen because of the location of their origin. And again, this speaks especially in Ottonian times, where these environments were resuming dramatically classical literature, or the Latin one in particular, like the sense of like saying the Greeks call these peoples just because of their physical features as those that we call Norsemen today, of course, does refer to the fact that there was a strong identification in at least the Rus establishment in the Normans, as was seen at the time. Then there is Leo the Diacon, a 10th century Byzantine historian and chronicler, referring to the Rus instead as the Scythians, in the typical, instead more Greek ethnographic tradition proper of the Byzantines at that point, that intends with this term, like, again, mostly anyone would have inhabited north of the Black Sea, and in the form of nomads, because the Scythians at some point were called also the Turks, but the Byzantines called, just to make you understand, the French Crusaders the Gauls, right? So because they had to stick by default just to the classical source. So you understand how different the Latin word of Liutprand really was, right? Actually much more flexible-minded. So that info is interesting because it does show again that at this point power had been assumed at least by the same stock that in the West was known as the Norse, in a very broad sense, because mostly say the Varangians also were Swedes, but it was much more composite, right, in nature. It encompassed a broader area of Northern Europe, definitely with a greater concentration in Scandinavia, and especially in the Eastern one, So surely the majority were Swedes, but not only. In fact, Rusʹ, that we will see in a while, as the semi-mythical founder of the Kyivan dynasty, is witnessed in Carolingian times in the West, right, as being a Danish pirate, like a Viking, who had somewhat failed against the Franks, and so went to the Baltic and started his fortune mostly to this great extent there. Right, we will have to explain now how this mechanism occurred. And in this we rely on the primary chronicle, right? Speaking of the territories of the East Slavs in the 9th century being divided between, this is the terminology, the Varangians and the Khazars. So it was already a pretty clear and pretty reliable indicator between whoever you wanted to call this kind of areas, between, say, the Slavs of the forest and kind of the steppe area was mostly hegemonized by the Khazars, but also inhabited by, still, as we've seen, either Slavs or Iranians, and that probably made up, in fact, the majority of the population, especially at that time, because there were different waves of other peoples, also in those very centuries. So also the ethnic profile of those areas was somehow different from today. Now, the Varangians are presented, remember, we're talking about Varangians, because the primary chronicle wanted to stress the fact that the origin was north, in a certain way. It says that they are first mentioned imposing tribute from Slavic and Finnic tribes in 859. In 862, the Finns and the Slavs in the area of Novgorod rebel against the Varangians, driving them, quote, back beyond the sea to the Baltic, refusing them further tribute, set out to govern themselves. Now, this first indication is quite meaningful because it shows that, after all, in some of the most primitive areas of the north, of the Slavic and Finnic, and at least not the Finnic north, because it was more like the Finnic south or west, if you prefer, but were capable of literally overthrowing what was at the time a major Viking force in that direction. It is true, again, that the Scandinavians were mostly interested, as you know, in the collapse of the richer and bigger Carolingian giant, right? So the Baltic had less to offer, and the Scandinavians will naturally colonize the coasts during the Viking era, but would turn into kind of more direct inland occupation only after actually the end of the same Viking era. So doing the same thing that they were habituated to do in the West, but now not having the possibility to do it anymore, turning to the East. But of course, some, and probably some among the hungriest Norse men, were already there in the East. So why is it meaningful that these... First of all, the primary chronicle says that the Slavs and the Finns, especially the fact that they kept memory of the latter, is also fascinating and accurate, right? So probably there was an important knowledge behind this too. Were initially able to literally expel the Norse already. So there was definitely the memory that this was not a Norse subjugation, or something that at least was just, okay, we descend from those guys, so those were the best, the strongest, whatever. Now, of course, their hero arrives now, but it's still a more complex system. There was a struggle between the two. It wasn't easy for the Norse to simply step in these areas and simply ruling over these peoples that were, however, still pretty warlike on their own. So politically divided, that they decide once again, but after having proved they had managed to keep the Norse out, to need again a sort of pacifier, somebody who could bring peace in the region. And this attitude we have seen very often in other contexts where there is especially a sort of communal reality to which the tribal one in this north can be compared, that is confident enough of its own establishment to say, we can call somebody from the outside to bring order over us, but hoping, of course, they will maintain our own customs, laws, right, government. This is, again, particularly important because I don't know in history any other people said, let's call these other people to make us to invaded and conquered and ruled over because just we're a bunch of idiots, we cannot rule ourselves. And this is one of the single most important concepts, in my opinion, of the primary chronicle. That says, quote, they said, so the Slavs and the Finns, let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law. Right, so in a just way, in respecting our customs. So as it was, like, as the say medieval overlordship was normally conceived, right? Kings didn't rule over peoples just as a personal possession. Even even when they started having enough power in feudalism, they started thinking like this. It was still, even however at that time, the communities accepting you as a ruler as long as you respected their own law and you could provide with justice without interfering also too much in their own kind of mob-like business. So they continuing, they accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Rus. So these guys cross the Baltic Sea and go to the, presumably the Swedes here, and tell them, look, we need some of your bands, war bands, and some of your military leaders to take control of a certain situation among us as a sort of broader police or force that can keep the situation pacified. This is just, the most similar thing we've encountered during the Middle Ages is the Podestà and the Italian communes, right? It's very similar, and in a situation in which, as you know, the communal government was actually quite developed, so the Podestàs were mostly militarily entrusted mostly with a military task, right? Respecting the political and civic institutions of the commune. So in a much more primitive, also earlier context, and brutal one, and kind of unstable one, again, the fact that the same primary chronicler remembers that it was essentially the locals who needed these people to be ruled over could even be just a bit, of course, edifying, in the sense that much of this issue had occurred by actual conquest, by actual subjugation, and of course lots of people were massacred, because naturally there was an opposition to this. And it's obvious, we've seen it in other times, that when times are mature to invade a people, like for example, think about the Irish in Anglo-Norman times, right? It was normally like these exiles, somebody who was struggling for power in some even of the most advanced parts of the, in that case, of the island, that says we need the support, right, of some overlord, so that, of course, government in the area will remain somehow autonomous, but at least we will be backed by the system. We will probably even enter in the same, right? So that's why I say that, for example, this situation differs remarkably from the aforementioned example, because again, the Kyivan Rusʹ was even more advanced and more prosperous than what the Scandinavians had, right? So as far as, especially as that south is concerned, this narrative seems more accurate, as we'll see how it develops. And in fact, what do they say? It says the Chuds, the Slavs, the Krivichs, and the West then said to the Rus. So this was this delegation. And the Rus, interestingly, from a 12th century perspective, what were called the Scandinavians, quote, our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. They thus selected 3 brothers with their kinfolk, who took with them all the Rus and migrated. Right? This is definitely the history of mercenary hiring. This is some kind of Scandinavian warlord that is called to bring order in an area, either because there were some exiles again, or there was a joint hope, let's say, to pacify the region, because the system was engulfed in perennial warfare. Nobody could really bring an end to it. It does happen historically, especially in the Middle Ages. There are examples of this. So according to the story, these three brothers, Rurik, Sineus, and Truvor, established themselves in, respectively, Novgorod, Belozero, and Izborsk, respectively. So according to the story, two of the brothers died, so Rurik remains the sole ruler of the territory, and he would become, in fact, the progenitor, albeit we're not entirely sure, as we'll see now, of the Rurik dynasty. Also, sometime later, remember the kinfolk that this man came from? It's interesting that these three leaders were selected by the delegation. So literally, it looks even more as a mercenary thing. And they come from their kinfolks, which has to do, of course, with, in part, of colonization, for sure. They brought, like, probably an important part of their clans extendedly so even kind of what you would call civilians, at least women, children with their families, they did come, but they were mostly military clans as such. Right, there were mostly these autonomous communities that they lead. They decided to find a new future in this area that offered an opportunity in that regard. So they come with their retinues, etc. There are some of Rurik's followers that are Askold and Dir, who ask him permission even to go to what was known as Tsargrad, so the city of the emperor, which is Constantinople, of course, also known as the great city Miklagard by the Scandinavians. And we know, of course, that there were lots of these men who at the time went servicing the imperial guard in Constantinople. And on their way south, they discovered a small city on a hill, at least according to the story. It was Kyiv. So they captured it, together with the surrounding country, essentially expelling the Khazars from there, and began to colonize it with more Varangians, right, establishing their dominion over the country of the Polanians, so the Polanians, as we've seen. So this piece of the story gives us other insight. First of all, this movement was evidently not completely controlled by Rurik himself, because also the Scandinavians had somehow egalitarian organization. Especially these war bands were very entrepreneuring, autonomous, aggressive, and they decided to go servicing in Constantinople. And along the way, they managed to storm what essentially was a Kyiv, the first true permanent, kind of city we can date exactly around the same time. Not that it wasn't inhabited before. There are also legends that this was an old settlement from the migration era. Of course, the place was populated from before, right? The degree what this was politically, institutionally, is another matter we cannot know. But the interesting fact is that, first of all, these guys managed to take over. And what it sounds like is that they basically freed the place from a Khazar dominion. And so it's not that they started to become ruling over Khazars that didn't inhabit the region of Kyiv, but the country of the Polanians. This is very interesting. But Polanians is like, poly in that sense means field, because these were the more open grounds with farmland south of the forest area, that in between the forest and the steppe was still importantly fertile ones, and that's why also the Kyivan position was so important, right? And all this, evidently, what if they were just going to Constantinople, and this was a way for saying that they just were hired as mercenaries by the locals to to get rid of the Khazars sounds pretty correct. So even from this picture, we have that Rurik initially doesn't even have to do with the original coming to power of the Varangians in Kyiv, and that this was done by the locals essentially managing to liberate themselves from the Khazar dominion by hiring these men who, by some extent, also ruled the country with evidently a local support, and also because these troops were evidently needed also to keep up with the struggle against the Khazars that in fact would be later crushed entirely in their khanate by the Rus. The interesting fact is that after this, the chronicle states that Askold and Dir went on actually to Constantinople with a fleet which attacked the city, right, in 863-66. Other accounts date this attack at 860, and this was also a famous one. We've seen it in one of the Byzantine history videos because there was all the episode of Patriarch Photius describing the universal devastation of the suburbs and the nearby islands of Constantinople. So of course these Rus were not organized yet in a way to be able to take on the Theodosian walls or anything, so nor they would ever do. But of course they could loot around. They were already an important developed naval force, and it's obvious that they weren't just random guys with their personal retinues. This was already an expedition of some substance that evidently was fueled by the Slavic elements as well. Because imagine just you're crossing and going to Constantinople, by the way, with intention or either being hired or devastating, whatever. So just looking for opportunities, and you're able just to ravage the area without too much difficulty. Of course, this was also a contingental lucky strike, we can say, that even didn't end well in the end, because there was either a storm or a miracle, right, after a ceremonial appeal by the Patriarch and the Emperor to the Virgin. So this event already shows that the Rus are able to mobilize a major power base among the Slavs that are evidently providing them with that force just on their own account. And this is the first episode after which, in fact, the Byzantines start the evangelization of the Rus, because they sent missionaries to talk, to convert the Rus and the Slavs at the same time. And in fact, more constructive relations would follow from that. And there is evidently a propulsion that the Norse gave to this, to however, a pre-existent Slavic force that was coalescing, especially across the Dnieper River. This is the moment, also the foundation of the Kievan state, right? Because evidently the same Byzantines were interested in this system. They were interested in, say, just against Novgorod or the far north, or even what was happening in Scandinavia, that initial Rurik settlement in the north. They were interested in what was happening just essentially in today's Ukraine, right? An area that the Byzantines knew well, if anything, because they had avant-posts on the Crimean and also probably the continental coast that they had taken care of, particularly, especially after the loss of the Egyptian granary to the Arabs in the 7th century, to get supply for feeding the Constantinopolitan mob, right? Rurik leads, and this is perhaps the best term, because again, it's not that he ruled over properly a polity, right? He was mostly like the charismatic figure that inflamed the conquest fantasies of these Norse adventurers in the north, and as we've seen, had managed to settle in this Slavic Finnic area. He died there in 879, and he bequeathed his kingdom to his kinsman, probably as a brother-in-law, Oleg, as regent for his own son, Igor. Now, Oleg is an interesting figure because he led a military force, according to the chronology, in 882, south along the Dnieper River. He captured multiple strongholds, such as Smolensk, Lubeck, before reaching Kyiv, where he actually deposed and killed Askoldendir, proclaimed himself prince, and declared Kyiv the mother of Rus cities, a title that, together with the eventual Christianization of the Rus, will be kept by the city for good, right? Even as the third Rome, and as properly the center of the Grand Principality that ruled over in theory, is the Rus, right? What is, the same later Tsar title of all the Rus, of all the Russias, if you wanted, plural, because it was all these various principalities that had been somehow hegemonized according to this genealogy by the descendants of Rurik, as we will see now through Igor. Actually, we stopped to Igor, but as you know, he married Olga of Kyiv. There is all that's the beginning, the fact of the opening to Christianization, because at least she baptized. I made a video about her, at least in comparison with Rastislav of Bohemia, Boris of Bulgaria, because explaining essentially what were the advantages of the Christianization and in the process of state building and creating the dramatic power that in fact Kyiv would gain in any other Slavic power, including Bulgaria, by the way, because they came even to threaten at some point and to challenge that power. Right, think about the Croats, the Tiverians. I'm talking about the Croats of the Carpathian ones, and even entering Transylvania by a certain regard. So actually, the Russian influence was enormous for all that, and you understand that this would have never been possible without the Slavic demographic and economic power base that was already expanding remarkably. The killing of Askold and Dir is also meaningful because it shows how not really unitary the previous government really was. First of all, because there were two guys at the time, and so still embodying probably the fact that these were two warlords supported by different local factions, and that Rurik's at least appointed regent for his son Igor decided to literally abandon, at least not abandoning the control, but like as a seat, as a residence in the north, to install himself in Kyiv, showing that of course it was the most advantageous place to rule from, right, and still killing them. So showing after all how permeable these powers really were, because he was supported by some other elements locally. The same capture of Smolensk and Lubeck is not random. Of course, these Norse had the manpower where this military warbands, because they were living that period of expansion. They literally lived as military retinues. They had had this huge opportunity of looting Francia, practicing that kind of entrepreneurial business made of slavery, trade, etc. And so knowing how to handle men, slaves, wealth, knowing where to invest it, and cutting their way through people accordingly. So knowing very well how to fight, and being also much kind of brutally specialized in that, like compact in these war bands, right? It's as if we were talking about the Comitatus, the Germanic Comitatus, Viking Norse Comitatus, and a sort of Slavic Zippe, but we don't have to think that the Slavs here weren't kind of flocking even under their command, because they saw the opportunity to loot and pillage, and also coming to power in such a prestigious place like Kiev itself, that still had, however, its own aristocracy, its means, and so on. In fact, it's interesting that Oleg deposes and kills Askald and Dir. Doesn't say, he stormed, he fought the Kyivans per se. On the contrary, he declares the city the mother of the Rus cities, right? Of the Rus cities. It doesn't say we are, the mother of Rus city is some place in Scandinavia, so we come here to rule in the realm. No, there is an awareness that Kiev is the center of something called Rus now, that is more like a broader activity. It's as if you said Vikings at that point. And so the most prestigious center where that kind of adventurer could base his power from. This can be debated naturally, again, in the light of the 12th century historiographical mindset, like background and reasons and meanings that were attached to this enterprise. The mother of the Rus cities, this sense also of the, in fact, if this kind of Slavic fertility, probably the Norse had a much more brutally rigid, patriarchic mentality regarding, they would have not maybe liked the concept of mother per se, but probably this was true also for the Slavic elites as far as they were concerned, as opposed to the rest of the Slavic peasantry that was kind of more chthonic and kind of, in fact, fertility cult oriented in that regard. But as you know, that the motherland is a concept that remains in the Slavic world as opposed to the fatherland in the Germanic one. So that's yet another aspect that perhaps we will have to deal on another occasion, in that we also should contextualize again for what the Norse Slavic establishment could think culturally of themselves at the time, because again, the Slavic onomastics is brutally imperialistically Indo-European, right? The absolute essence of the Slavic identity revolves around the slava, the glory, and so the divine right to rule over the world. So it's a concept that again was shared by everybody, by the Romans. They considered the Byzantine connection there may have surely fueled also the models of Russian leadership, the same Germano-Norse one as well. So it's all part of the same group. For not talking about the Iranian substratum, that is probably here the great elephant in the room, which was the most fanatically exalted, ruthless, and devoid of any scruple of human life-based imperialistic identity reform ever existing in history of mankind, and that was deeply ingrained in the local Slavic leadership that had essentially mixed with that as well. So this was the real mentality behind the establishment of the Rus, and in this sense didn't really matter who was Norse, who was Slav, because what did these people care about anyhow. The main identity at the time was clan-based, was status-based. If you could marry in the clan of a powerful warrior, what these people cared about was the stock, was the race. That's the same reason why probably the concept of the Rus and the Rurikid descendants also stuck so much, because these people cared about their own genetics. They cared about being, again, descended of a sacred dynasty that was blessed by God with. And remember that in paganism there is only one God actually, as the universal ruler. The rest is just a expression of the same. And that, especially among this leadership that thinks exclusively about this, and that they were quite jealous of in their identity. Comparatively, the rich merchants of Kyiv, of other great Russian cities, in this major waterways, were kind of another paste. And of course they were much more also civilized, because that's also probably what we're missing here, that thanks to the Khazar influence, the Abbasid influence, the Byzantine influence, and also the Central European one, it was developing around the same patterns. The Russian Palatinate evolved from what was starting to be a quite let's call it urbanized and mercantile and also incipiently statal dimension. And it's difficult to assess, especially the latter aspect, because again, things were probably in some instances more primitive than we think, at least as far as this hypothesis is concerned, because again, it seems that in the same period, probably even the Khazars or the Slavs had began to properly build true cities as we intend them, at least for high medieval standards in the area. But if they did, it's because the area was booming demographically and economically, and there was a lot to protect, a lot to control. And the 10th century, especially as far as these, say, peripheral peoples compared to the Carolingian Empire in Europe, were prospering out of, in fact, slave trade from the same raids on all around on the great sedentary empires, and as we'll see, reaching pretty faraway places, especially in the area north of the Black Sea. This had been normal. The Scythians had been raiding as far as Mesopotamia since millennia, and we'll find that Oleg, according to a Khazar source, was killed in an expedition, or at least died in an expedition in what seems to be Farsa, so Persia, which was probably a Caucasian Islamic area rather than the Iranian plateau itself, but still that far. Also, as you understand, raiding the Khazar Khaganate, and even or managing to find a way through it. So with a dramatic projectional capacity by land, by sea, and definitely with a level of political, military, logistical organization that is nothing short of extraordinary for the times and places. And this was to be based necessarily on the local resources. That's why the same Oleg came to rule in Kyiv, not from Novgorod, right? The interesting aspect of this, in fact, is that Oleg set about consolidating his power over the surrounding region and the riverways north up to Novgorod, imposing tribute on the East Slav tribes that are, as we were saying before, were also quite different in development. In 883, for example, he conquered the Drevlians, which inhabited the territories of Polesia on the right bank of Ukraine. Still, according to the chronology, in 885 he had subjugated the Polians, the Severians, the Yatichi, the Radimichs, forbidding them to pay further tribute to the Khazars in the process. By the way, this is an imperial policy, first of all, it's basically a brutal shift from a Turkic to a Slavic dominated reality, right? This is essentially this Eastern Slavic area agreeing to pay tribute to these Norse political military ruler that had been entrusted power by the most developed Slavic areas to get rid of the entire region of the Khazar yoke, or at least this kind of tribute system that eventually was now too not just too heavy economically, but politically, in the sense that now the local resources were rendering useless because the locals could simply use the same resources now to get rid of the tribute and invest in conquest and passing on the offensive, right? Oleg didn't bring from Scandinavia further resources that he was bringing there, some kind of command skill, right? And consider that he was probably of a because there are problems regarding the chronology. He lived too long, according to the Slavic one. So we are actually thinking he is just a general figure entitled Oleg as holy, right? So a title that all the Kyivan princes would have adopted because they were thought to be gloriously winning in that sense. So these men had now essentially an Eastern Slav power base, not a Scandinavian one anymore. They could hire other troops from Scandinavia. They could subsidize them. They could reward them with the loot and so on. But again, on a power base that depended on Eastern Europe. Oleg continued to develop and expand a network of Rus forts, by the way, in Slavic lands, begun by Rurik in the north. This seems to be also more Viking in nature, because that the Norse somehow fortified important areas. Think about Ireland, where basically the most important Irish cities still derive from the Viking ring forts. The Slavs, however, already had an important amount of that too, or at least even the Khazars had already built important strongholds, citadels in the pre-existing Slavic settlements. The Gords all over Central Eastern Europe were pretty much the standard type of fortified settlement, and so it was just a matter of expanding that, right? And the entire region provided, through tributes, the Kyivan state with furs, bees, wax, honey, slaves that were all exported, right? Because they controlled the three main trade routes of Eastern Europe. Like in the north, Novgorod served as a commercial link between the Baltic Sea and the Volga trade route, up to the lands of the Volga Bulgars, the Khazars, across the Caspian Sea as far as Baghdad, right, and even reaching Central Asia and the Middle East further. Then there was a trade from the Baltic that was moved south, exactly by the Varangians, on the network of rivers and short portages along the Dnieper. There was a major waterway, in fact, in which Kyiv is, known as the route from the Varangians to the Greeks, quite eloquently, because that's where the Byzantines also bought lots of slaves, weapons, furs, and so on. And this entails, if you understand the scale of it territorially, an enormous coordination capacity and political cooperation. So in other words, it's impossible not to see in this the contribution of the entire Slavic system that was just only controlled by, again, a dynasty that married also in the local Slavic aristocracy, and that was again all intermarried, in fact, in the Rus. So a rigid separation between saying these were just the Norse or the Slavs, that doesn't quite make sense per se. If they had not cooperated, there would have never been this thing. Nor this could have been just a brutal exploitation of the conquerors that just didn't simply lack the sheer manpower to achieve anything of that scale, just to enforce it on the people. So as the primary chronicle actually very intelligently puts, since the beginning, these Norse had been just called to organize the local power, to maintain a direct control through their military skill, and it should be seen as a broader process carried out also by multiple war bands that were, of course, all around. And this is also what favored the use of Rus for the whole system, because we are just documented for the Rurikids, but it's obvious that there were lots of other warriors that fought here and there, and we see it quite clearly, and there is always, however, still a dynastic connection of some sort. Still also with Scandinavia, still later on also with the Byzantine Empire. So a big political game that, frankly, the Scandinavians were not playing at the time as individual kind of, I don't know, Danish kings or Norwegian kings. This was something specifically pertaining to the Kyivan Rusʹ that was a huge power, as we've just seen in the area. It cannot be compared with just anything that the Varangians per se could achieve alone. By the way, there is an interesting detail that I forgot to mention before when it says that Rorik had come with Sinews and Truvor that actually would seem like, in a Old Norse sense, like his house, Sinews, seine house, basically. And the true word would be the sworn companions, like, and so this household and the retinue, etc., that however still have been connected to proper names also by at the same time, such as in fact Rurik, Svein, and Thorvard as well. But if you consider it from it being stated by the primary chronicle, let's say it could easily have been misinterpreted as literally the names of the people, while meaning the household and the mercenaries are just repeated as such. In the latter case, it would actually tell us how deeply ingrained in the memory, at least of those who had founded the dynasty, was the pride of their own household, of their own name, as opposed to just some random guy name, right? And I actually, even though historiography leaned towards like these could be actually the names of Sweyn and this other, I like to think that it is actually at that point the Slavic memory of that Rorik's household in the glory, in fact, of the same Rurikid dynasty's legacy. And as we've seen, there were also other leaders under Rorik that would have make the point alone, and just regarding the composite nature of this Norse settlement as well, so in a political sense. So I am for that interpretation. The location of Kyiv as the main center speaks by itself, right? It's a central outpost on the Dnieper route, a hub with the east-west overland trade, one between the Khazar and the Germanic lands of Central Europe. It's really like the most important center, frankly, in the entire region. And it may have been a staging post for Radhanite Jewish traders, by the way, between Western Europe, Atil, that was the Bulgar capital, in China. The Jews would eventually spread further after the collapse of the Khazar Khaganate, whose establishment had partly converted to Judaism, some to Islam, some even to Christianity. The reason being that it was a way to enter a bit more the circle of the universal powers, like acquiring an Abrahamic religion, but still being different both from Christianity and Islam. So from the Byzantines and the Abbasids were just pretty close, but that they had very, in fact, that they were partially threatened by, but in part also they had lots of trade going on with, and at some point a Khazar princess married also in the Byzantine imperial family. So it was a way, again, to be a bit more acceptable. It's the same reason why the Rus converted to Christianity, just given that the entire Europe was, for obviously advantageous reasons. So the destruction of the Khazar Khaganate at the hand of the Rus would spread all over Central and Eastern Europe. This Jewish communities that, given their fate, were cleverly exploited by the local rulers, and also entrusted with great privileges in the state building that mostly revolved around, in fact, these grods, quickly evolving into very large centers that required an administration, required somebody that could deal with money lending. And given that, from a Christian law perspective, of course, Christians couldn't engage in those activities. The Jews were let just doing that, essentially. Not just that, because many of them had, first of all, a good education at those levels of that status, and also other occupations, but being in this sense much more dependent as properly the king's man, right, the prince's man. And some of the greatest centers, in fact, in Central Europe, like Prague, like in part the same Kyiv, developed through these administrators. These commercial connections enriched the Rus merchant and princes. It allowed them to fund the military forces that made of the Kyivan Principality also one of the most interesting one of the most interesting armies of the time. It was an incredibly developed system, mixing, in fact, Slavic, Iranian, Turkic, Byzantine, Norse elements, an importantly strong cavalry, navy, that managed, in fact, to crush also some of the most effective enemies, and launching raids deep in far away, even in some Central Asian, Middle Eastern, and even Byzantine and Central European, Northern European localities. So really a shared military culture based on this initial very well adjusted balance between the princes, the merchants, that could rely on again this important resources embodied by the amazing churches, palaces, fortifications, and further towns all over the region. Demand for luxury goods fostered production of expensive jewelry, religious wares that could also be exported. Right, so an advanced credit and money lending system was surely in place, as we were saying before. And again, especially as far as the broader Viking era lasted, the transcontinental traffic that Kyiv could control was enormous for the time standard. So that this speaks also of a fast enrichment and of a quick consolidation of, again, a reality that if it hadn't been for the Mongols, would probably gone far in consolidating a further kind of Central European reality rather than Eastern European, because it was similar again to Poland, to other Central European countries. And of course, it was a stagnation towards the 13th century, that speaks also of a crisis. It's because there were lands of new civilization. But given that we are so systemically underdocumented about the area compared to others in Europe, in one sense that speaks, of course, of also the different stage of development. But consider again that the Mongol invasions were pretty destructive. We can see that impact even in more western regions such as Poland, and the sheer scale of damage that this produced, especially the collapse of that thriving mercantile element that still, in the rest of Europe by the 13th century was rocketing, right, and instead was destroyed exactly at that point by the Mongols. So again, the system did not disappear, right? But there is surely a major structural impact that those events brought on the center. Now, on the wall Rusʹ that, in fact, we will have to document in detail in all the various areas because they had different stories, different identities, right? It's difficult to talk about a true commonality in such a huge territory, right? The important being the centrality of the Kyivan Principality and, of course, the great process of acculturation of civilization accomplished by Christianization, the connection with the Byzantine world, and thus the development of that Eastern European culture that we know better, even through those darker Mongol times. But that is often overlooked, especially in my opinion, Central European connection existing with countries like Poland, Hungary, also Lithuania. In that sense, we're still talking about within Eastern Europe, but especially with Poland, that will essentially come to include the Russian Palatinate, and after the Polish partitions also bring Galicia essentially in the orbit of the Habsburgic Empire. We see actually great proximity with the West. We've seen it even in the modern age, right? Thanks to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, that at a point, unfortunately, it failed, but it could transform itself in a Polish-Lithuanian-Ukrainian one. There was the influence of the Italian Renaissance, the aforementioned accomplishment of the church unification. It was a true Orthodox unification with Papal Rome, with the Uniate Church that even in the early 20th century was a major promoter of Ukrainian national identity, and that bore this enormous cultural legacy of the Russian Palatinate. It was also reinvigorated with Polish culture, Latin culture, and so on, and that importantly distinguished it from the rest of what we call Russia today, and that in this sense made properly a different culture, identity, and civilization on its own, that in this sense has been forgotten. And the history of Central and Eastern Europe in this sense should be reacquired properly at a popular level, as I was saying before, in a way that the belated establishment of a common European school must take in consideration, because it's one of the single most important and forgotten pages of European history that has a much greater, say, a much forming and systemic influence that what we have. I say it speaking even from a more narrowly Western European perspective, ignored, neglected. This has been a consequence of course, mostly like mass education in Western Europe also came in times in which, of course, Ukraine was already seen just as a subject country of the Tsarist Empire, and then eventually, the communism arrived, and so we came to look at just like everything that was, from the other side of the Iron Curtain as something, right, that we also had never quite thoroughly gotten interested in. That, of course, historically had suffered of many, and especially of this constant pressure received from the steppes, even think about the Mongols, but also the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. So all an area that we tended to mostly see as the other, but that technically was one of the single most European and thus close ones in the same continent, that deserves an enormous consideration and an appreciation, in my opinion, because once you come to acknowledge it, it gives you a scale of how much, even as Westerners, we have lost for the lack of a more common effort to take care of the broader East, let's say, and that could instead strengthen dramatically our, frankly, what I see as also in the future as a dominating role in the world. I think that Europe doesn't have but an imperial and colonial and protectionistic vocation, just for the sake of its survival. So this is another topic, but surely these lands are the beating heart of our own culture, altogether with the others, and must in this sense be protected, exalted, nurtured, and learned, right? First and foremost, because very often totalitarianism has stripped the same countries of the awareness of themselves, and that's something that, of course, only the lack of knowledge can bring, but that can be cured with knowledge, and any chain will be dissolved, because ignorance is lack of power, it's lack of dignity, it's actually lack of humanity and of divinity. And so our greatest power derives from all what we can get from it all, and together, because the greatest power, the same values in which these polities believed originally and formed the one that we know, were based on that same traditional, universal, imperial ideology, and deserve to be restored fully as such, for what instead the degeneration of statalism, collectivism, and nationalism and socialism have denied them from fully being. So I would like also to take this chance, as I already did in that video, about say happy holidays, to wish a warm happy Christmas to all our Orthodox sisters and brothers, and especially those who are fighting for their own freedom, and hoping also the others to realize what is really going on in front of our eyes, because this very history is what lives in their veins, and that's what their accomplishment proves. And so for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And thank you heartfully, as always, for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.